Hello, I'm John, and welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we take a look at people who have had experiences that have brought them closer to believing in the supernatural. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy the video.
When I was 13, my family and I moved into an old house in the center of the city. Everything was fine until we had lived there for about a month. My sister and I had rooms on the bottom floor, with a set of stairs opposite my bedroom door. We started to hear heavy footsteps going up and down the stairs and hallway at night. I assumed that it was just my sister walking around. My parents' bedroom was upstairs, until I talked to her about it, and she said she'd heard it too and thought it was me. Since I could see the staircase from my bedroom and I slept with my door open, I started to watch out for the source of the footsteps. I heard the footsteps go past and up the stairs, but there was no one there. After this, things just got more creepy. Every time I'd turn off my bedroom light to go to sleep, I'd hear heavy breathing by my face. The cat who slept on my bed would freak out and run when she heard it, so I know I didn't imagine it. I started to hear scratching sounds, much louder than mice could be, inside my walls. I dreamed of a fire that had been in the house, and when we redecorated, we found the walls had been charred. My dad painted the spare bedroom and said when he'd started that the walls and floor had started banging. We'd often hear someone behind us when we were cooking in the kitchen, and the floors of every room downstairs would bang sporadically. The final straw was when my dad woke up to someone sitting down on my parents' bed. He felt hands around his neck and started getting suffocated. He said that the entity suddenly stopped, and he could hear it walk away. We stayed in that house for 3 years before giving up and moving. This happened to my father and me back in Iran in 1989. My neighbor was an elderly man living with his wife on the first floor of our apartment complex. No one liked them because they would always start drama with the other neighbors. He had no children and no relatives. When he passed away, everyone breathed a sigh of relief and just passed it off as one last problem to deal with. It is in Muslim tradition that his body be carried to the graveyard by men and be washed and cleaned by men. No one came to do this duty, so my dad and I, as a token of respect, decided to do it for him and his widow. We followed the tradition, and only us two and his wife were at the funeral. That night, my dad and I stayed up and played Golden Axe 3 on the Sega when it suddenly got cold in our living room. My dad and I decided to investigate how it got to 5 degrees in our living room in under 10 minutes in the middle of an Iranian summer night. Suddenly, my dad and I saw Mr. Tabrizi standing in front of us with teary eyes, saying Muchakaram, Muchakaram, Muchakaram. Which translated to I am grateful. We stood there frozen and scared, and we woke up my mom and told her the story. She decided to go and wake up his widow. The widow told my mother the exact same story without having to have heard it from her. To this day, this scares the snot out of me and my dad. We are both atheists and anti-theists, but at times even I am scared. I don't know what I saw, but I am keeping my mind open to extreme possibilities. In my first weeks at college, I'd met some people. One was a guy I liked, but nothing had come of it. One evening I'm sitting in my dorm room and suddenly think, I have to clean, John's coming over. Then, of course, I think that's ridiculous. But I can't shake the idea, so I clean. Within 10 to 15 minutes, John arrives at my door. Conclusion: either there are methods of perception we haven't identified yet, or, despite the likely astronomical odds against it, I coincidentally thought something extremely unlikely, and the extremely unlikely thing came to pass. And I do not mean that sarcastically. A personal theory is that one trait that leads people to believe supernatural stuff is an inability to comprehend that unlikely, even extremely unlikely, does not equate to impossible. But it was a very weird event. I have two. Once, the first night after my childhood dog died, I woke up suddenly out of a dead sleep. A giant flash of light lit up the entire room, but no thunder followed. The following morning, I asked my parents if they had seen the lightning. They said yes, saying that they had both woken up immediately before for no reason. My mother said that before she fell asleep, she prayed that she could get a sign that our dog was now pain-free and happy in another place. That was our sign. The second time was the night my grandfather died. I was very ill and only getting worse. I hadn't been able to go to say goodbye to Gramp before he died because of my own illness, and I felt terribly guilty and sad. I woke up to a tugging sensation on my leg and saw my grandfather standing at the foot of my bed, smiling. He told me to let go of the grief, that he knew I would have come to see him if I could have, and said he was taking my illness away with him when he left. The next day, before I told anyone what had happened, my parents asked me if I had been up in the night. Apparently, they heard footsteps on the stairs and my bedroom door opening and closing. During my senior year of high school, me, my best friend at the time, and a few other girls would go to this cemetery that is supposedly haunted, the name of which is Dice Cemetery. Well, we had walked around it before and whatnot, but one time we went there, my friend and I decided to kind of stray from the group to scare our friends. But when we were about to come out, there was a family there that was looking for ghosts or spirits or whatever. They had set up camera equipment and were shining lasers and all kinds of weird stuff to find them. So we were creeping along the woods looking for our friends so that we could leave. The family was very creepy. Well, I was walking ahead of my friend and stopped and put my hand on a gravestone, and it felt like I got flipped upside down and was just super lightheaded. That really weirded me out. I have no idea what caused it or whatever, but it seemed appropriate for this question. Good times. This probably won't see the light of day, but I have one for you. Actually, I have several, but I'm going to go for the first and most innocent one. When I was around 4 or 5, my mom gave me a toy harmonica to play with. Nothing much, just something to keep me out of her way. After a bit of time, I found my mom to show her all the things I learned how to play. I'm being generous here, I was young. She decided to humor me and let me believe that I was actually playing something that didn't sound like the musical equivalent of nails on a chalkboard. She asked me who taught me how to play so well. My response? Grandpa. My grandfather died a few months before I was born. Hell, I was even named for him. The thing is, no one really talked about him around me, much less said anything about him playing the harmonica. I was in the kitchen doing homework. This was middle school. Near me on the floor was a piece of paper with a torn triangular corner. I, being the average lazy kid, bypassed the piece of paper for days without cleaning it up, next to a long rectangular table full of scattered books and papers of all sorts. This particular day, I was doing homework in the kitchen nook, and it suddenly caught my eye as I sat. It was falling, with that fluttering type of slow fall that bits of paper do. I stopped to look at it. And it rose up in the air and fell again, fluttering to the tiled floor. This happened several times. At first I didn't believe my eyes, and secondly, I thought, well, maybe there was a wind source. I stand up and put my hand near the AC vent. Nothing. It's not a surprise because my grandparents rarely used it. I looked over at the window on the other side of the table. I went around the table in the opposite direction of the falling paper and checked to see if the window was open. It was not. All the while, this paper was being lifted and dropped to the same height as if a person were there doing it. My heart started to race. I was terrified. I am now in a kitchen nook, and I want out. I want to run. There is a deep fear in me as I still stand and watch this thing go straight up and flutter to the floor. Eventually, it felt like forever, even in memory, but it may have only been a few seconds when I decided to run past it. What a horrible feeling. I ran as fast as my feet could take me to the opposite side of the house, with that strange feeling someone was behind you, to where the only other person on the 5 acres or 5K foot house was, my deep sleeping grandmother, out with powerful medication. I shook her and begged her to wake up, but she wouldn't. I just stayed away from the kitchen until others came home. I don't remember anything else. And I rarely tell the story, but it will stick with me for life. I cannot fathom what kind of air source would produce such an event. It still bothers me. I am not religious, atheist, and I am quite skeptical of ghosts and that sort of thing. But this particular event has me perplexed. This needs a little background. One of my best friends was diagnosed with cancer on her birthday and died a scant 2 weeks later. My girlfriend tells me, just a few days later, that she had a dream where she saw my friend. Apparently she'd been trying to get in contact with me, and I wouldn't let her in. Well, no shit. But, hey, it was a dream. There's no reason to take it seriously at all. A few days after that, I'm at a carnival with some friends. We've seen some fireworks and listened to some live music. It's been a good night. And then I see my dead friend standing in the middle of a crowd. Same hair. Same height. Same figure. I tell myself that it's just somebody who looks like her. Then the rest of the crowd speeds up, and her movement slows down just slightly, like that old, classic effect you get in movies sometimes. She raises her hand and points at me. Directly at me. And then somebody walks in front of her, and she's gone. I just attribute it to me seeing things if the others with me hadn't also seen her and agreed that yes, that was our dead friend. I was in a room with a girl I just met and moved in with. I was young and adventurous. We were sitting across from each other in a large room, and we started having a conversation telepathically. At one point, we both started grinning, and I said, in 3 seconds, we should both say the word apple out loud. We did at the 3-second mark, and we were both shocked. We just met that day, and we became the best of friends. That was a great summer. Of course, we did just do a bunch of LSD hours before. Nonetheless, I am an atheist and non-believer, but I still leave the possibility open that humans might have the ability to communicate telepathically. Hopefully, science will prove this right. At around 8 years old, I was watching a program with my parents and their friend about the British occupation of some island, and my mom told me I turned to them and told them I was there. I gave them details they said I couldn't have known, even describing a wife and how I died. I have no recollection of this, but they say it's the weirdest thing that's ever happened to any of them. My grandparents also used to live abroad in South America, and when they first moved to Chile, my granddad was driving down a street in a town they'd never before been to, and one of their kids was thirsty, and my grandma said, "Don't worry, there's a shop around this corner," and there was, even though there's no possible way she could have known. Those two stories, while not incredibly astonishing, are from people I know who are very normal, down-to-earth people with no reason to lie to me and don't make things up, so they make me wonder. When I was 17, I had the first 2 of 3 out-of-body experiences. They were completely spontaneous. At the time, I had no real concept of out-of-body experiences. The third, a couple of years later, was somewhat more willed but identical in perceptual nature. The first time, I was sitting on the floor in a friend's bedroom watching cartoons, Bakshi's New Adventures of Mighty Mouse, with him and his girlfriend. I felt kind of sleepy and suddenly had a very strange feeling, like being on a swing set but only swinging backwards continuously, or repeatedly. I heard a kind of loud, whooshing sound, and suddenly I was looking at myself, sitting where I was. I found I could move my point of view around and even pass through the door. I saw his parents sitting in the living room watching TV. I went through the kitchen and down the stairs to the basement. I wanted some way to test if this was happening or if I was imagining it. I had never been in his basement before. It was finished and had a wood stove. His dad's collection of Hess trucks was displayed on small shelves throughout the room. I thought about not being able to get my body back in his room, and I almost immediately began being pulled backward by the same route. With a much less significant whoosh, I found my point of view back inside my head, where it belonged. Several months later, I had a few opportunities to go down there, and the layout, decor, and Hess trucks were just as I had seen them that night. About 3 months later, I was hanging out with a different friend at his parents' house. They were away on vacation, and we were sitting in his living room watching Gleaming the Cube on one of the cable movie channels. I was sitting or lying back on the couch with my feet on the coffee table in front of me. I felt sleepy and then had the same swinging feeling and eventually the whoosh as I had before. There I was, looking back at myself. Again, I wanted to see something I had not seen before, so I went upstairs to his sister's room. It was a small, converted attic at the top of a set of steep stairs. There were photos, drawings, and posters taped on the walls, and some clothes on the floor. Again, I thought about my body and was quickly whooshed back to my normal point of view. Some time later that year, I snuck up to her room one night when I was staying over. It was pretty much what I had seen, the same layout and furniture. The third time is easier to consider fantasy, but still real to me. It was nighttime, a couple of years after the last experience. I was lying on my own bed, thinking and sort of not really looking at the negative space between some leaves that were gently shaking with the breeze and playing in the light from the street lamp. I started to get a sleepy feeling and tried to see if I could get myself to feel the swinging again. After a while, I did and had the whoosh again. I was looking at myself lying on the bed. I decided to go outside. I had been having tragically unrequited feelings for a girl I was getting to know better than anyone before in my life, though ultimately no more than a friend. We hung out at her place several times a week for over a year, and she was fully and explicitly aware of my feelings. Trying to visit her out of my body is not exactly as creepy as it sounds without that context. I decided to follow the highway near my house in the direction of her apartment. The neighborhoods and crossroads passed by beneath me, and eventually I was at her apartment complex. Then I was at her window. Then I was in her room, looking at her as she slept. I noticed her cat was sitting up on the bed. I could have sworn she was looking right at me. I wanted to see if I could contact my friend in any way. I had no clue what I might be able to do, so I reached out to touch her. I never saw any sort of form of my own arm or anything. It was more of a feeling and a will to move or reach. As I touched her, I heard this awful screaming sound and got very scared. I was quickly pulled backwards as before, over the path I had taken to get there, all the way back into my body again. I looked at the clock. It was 4:05 a.m. I talked to her the next day. I asked if anything unusual had happened. She said her cat freaked out and woke her up just after 4 a.m. Now before I begin, I should let you know that I have never really been that religious. In fact, I would probably consider myself an atheist, but this one event has always stuck with me. The night before my grandmother died, most of my family came back to our house between hospital visits. At one point, my cousin needed to get in contact with his dad, so he used our phone. He dialed the wrong number and ended up calling a priest instead. He quickly realized he had the wrong number, apologized, and hung up. Nobody thought anything of it and went on with their day. During the night, my grandmother passed away. The next morning, the phone rang, and it ended up being the priest that my cousin had called by accident. He told my mom that he couldn't sleep that well because he sensed that something bad had happened to our family. This story may be pretty low on the supernatural scale, but I still think it was pretty strange. A few stories from a very close friend who had no reason to make any of it up. She has been my mom's very best friend for nearly 40 years. She and her husband were in the process of building a house, so they were renting a house in the meantime. They were informed upon renting that the house was haunted by a woman named Faith, though they didn't believe it, of course, not being superstitious people. However, she is a funny lady, and in the spirit, no pun intended, of a move, she placed a mattress in the room that was originally Faith's. They close all the doors in their house so that cats don't wander around from room to room while they're at work. One day she came home and all of the doors were open, and the mattress had been moved from the back room to the front room. 2. She was home alone one day, taking a shower in the middle of the day. It was bright out, so there was no reason to have the lights on in the bathroom. While she was showering, the door opened and the lights turned on. The lights turned off, and the door closed. 3. Her daughter was home visiting from college and awoke in the middle of the night to the feeling that she was being watched. She began to turn her head to look around the room but was unable to turn it, as though something was holding her head back. I don't know what to make of any of that, it's just creepy as fuck. Perhaps there are reasonable explanations, but, as I say to most ghost stories, it makes about as much sense as anything else. I was playing Manhunt when I was 14 or so, wandering around the neighborhood with the brother of one of my good friends, looking for members of the opposite team. We went into the side yard of one of the houses in the neighborhood, which a tall old lady had previously occupied but which was now owned by a young family. We were walking through this strange grove of trees, passing underneath this big, cool willow tree, when we both saw a tall, white figure move quickly past us. This was a pretty dark night, and we were far from all the street lights and house lights, but I was struck by how brightly white the figure appeared. I remember thinking that it almost seemed to be glowing. My partner and I sprinted after the figure, then briefly split up and headed in opposite directions, but maybe 10 seconds later we both stopped and headed towards each other. At this point, the adrenaline associated with chasing someone in a manhunt had worn off, and we both realized something was odd about the situation. No one in their right mind would be wearing bright white clothing while playing manhunt, and when the round ended, we confirmed that there definitely wasn't anyone involved in the game. And given how bright the figure was when we first saw it, it was very strange how quickly it had disappeared. Oh, and when I was 10, I heard a huge thunk on the roof on Christmas Eve around midnight. I had sadly accepted that Santa probably didn't exist a year or two beforehand, but that was enough to make me question my skepticism. And there's no way my dad would have climbed up on the roof to make some Santa-like noises. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor. We didn't have a ladder or anything that could have gotten him there, and the roof was really steeply pitched. Seeing a ghost with 2 other people, we all saw the same thing before anyone else pointed it out, so it was a doesn't that cloud look like a rabbit? Type of situational influence. Making it stranger was that we knew the ghost, and she had died just a week before, and we were at her funeral service, which was being held later in the day at a church in the middle of nowhere. My mom is a curandera, and I've been around some really fucking strange things in my life. I also saw what I believe could have been a UFO about 6 years ago. I was helping my brother fix his Jeep in his garage. His garage was situated behind his house at the basement level, so it was mostly dark where we were except for the light inside the basement. So we're standing there, and a gradual light appears in the sky. The trees around his house are really thick, and he lives in a large dip. The light descends into a field that was on the other side of a couple hundred feet of woods. It sits there for a while. We're discussing it the entire time after the initial surprise and silence. When we decided to take a walk over and see what it was, it started making a really loud sound. It was just noise, but it was really loud, and it wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. It took off into the sky really fast and just went out of view. It came down without a sound, and it came down very gently. I still don't really know what to believe it was. I have 2 stories. The first one is actually something that happened with my mom. We were about to leave to go to our cabin for Christmas vacation, and the night before we left, my mom had a dream that her jewelry got stolen. As a result, the morning we left, she separated all of her costume jewelry from her real stuff and hid the real stuff in a shoebox. To this day, I have no idea why she did that instead of putting it in the safe, but I suppose she just thought she was being silly but had to act on the dream. At the time, we had a babysitter that lived with us, but my parents had just fired her because, well, she was just fucking weird and creepy. Anyway, my dad didn't want to kick her out of the house right before Christmas, so they told her she just had to be gone by the time we got back. My older brother ended up coming home early to find our car stolen, and eventually we discovered my mom's jewelry missing. The babysitter found her good jewelry in the shoe box, and the only way she knew it was valuable stuff was because it was separated out. My mom's dream actually made it worse. Second, a few years ago, I was trying to go to sleep, and for no apparent reason, I started crying hysterically, convinced that my dog had cancer. I was so upset that I called my dad to talk to him about it, and even though I felt like it was completely illogical, I could not stop the emotion. The next day, I heard from one of my friends that his mom had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer that morning. Someone else said it, I'm not sure it's supernatural, but maybe something natural we just don't understand. Background info: when I was a senior in high school, my dad was working on a job 30 miles away. He is in construction, so his job really takes him all over Indiana, US. I get to school and everything is going like normal, go to class, break, lunch, class. Now, my mom works at the school, so I tend to see her a lot throughout the day. Today, however, I saw her once in the morning, and that was it. I'm not really thinking about it, I just shrug it off and go about my day. Right after lunch, I am walking to my 6th hour class and get called to the office. Okay, NBD, but wait, my sister does too? Weird coincidence. We both get there around the same time and just kind of look at each other like, WTF? I walk in first, and the secretaries, nurse, and tech admin, I TA'd for her, are standing in there just kind of looking at us. I stay calm, but my sister starts getting noticeably freaked out. They take us into the athletic director's office and have us sit down. They all look at us so solemnly, a look I will never forget, and tell us our dad had gotten hurt at his job and was being flown to a hospital in Indianapolis. This really hit me hard because he was working at a hospital. Why would they need to fly him to another country? The tech admin says our teachers have been notified that we will not be going to the rest of our classes that day, and we are on the road to Indianapolis 10 minutes later. It turns out Dad had fallen from a height of 3 feet, 1 meter. Really? He only feels 3 feet? Why is he getting a heli ride to Indy? Oh, his head broke in his fall. We get to the hospital, and my mom is handling it all like a boss. She shows us where her room is and then takes me to go see Dad in the ICU. The doctors had already performed surgery on him and had to put a tube into his brain to alleviate some of the pressure. The next day I drive down to see him, and they explain to me that they may have to put another tube in because the pressure is getting pretty high again. My dad was expected to die that night. My parents and my girlfriend's churches sent out prayer chains and all that good religious stuff. I stay up all night, sobbing by the window. It turns out the pressure went down just enough that they didn't need to have the surgery, and he made it through it all just fine. He gets out of the hospital and goes into rehab, then gets right back to work. From the day he got airlifted to the day he was back to work, it was, and I kid you not, 4 weeks. The man was supposed to die 4 weeks before he was back to work hanging drywall. Was it a miracle? Did some entity save my dad? Is my dad a Wolverine? Ike. Someone told me, while he was drunk and I was young, that he was 500 years old. Born in 1492, on the coast of Wales, in Swansea. My father was a sailor, and my mother was a barmaid. Over time, he eventually revealed, among very few other things, that he had lived in the American South in the 1800s. For numerous reasons, including the fact that he was outlandishly intelligent for his age, but there were better. I didn't make a lot of issue of this with him, and neither did he. He was a strange guy in many ways, but I was extremely hot for him, and I just got on with it. He was so smart at so much that it wasn't hard to believe, obliquely, deep down, I don't know. A few years ago, out of idleness and curiosity, I started wandering around genealogy websites looking for him. And the weird thing was that I found him. He has a very unusual first name, and I found a man by that name, first and middle initial, living in Tennessee in the 1800s. According to the old land and property documents I found, he was living with a man whose name was very close to a relative that he was staying with when I met him. The last name of the men in the documents wasn't the same as the name I knew them by, but they did use that name as an alias, which I found after discovering a recent photograph of another relative using that last name. He never mentioned these things to me, and I've never mentioned them to him. It's a really unusual name, especially for that time and place, even for this one, especially for a white man. I don't know. There are a lot of weird things surrounding that situation, and the most dismaying thing about what I've just told you is that it makes it harder to dismiss them as coincidences, selection bias, folie à deux, or shared hallucinations. I don't know if he's telling the truth. I haven't physically seen him in a very long time, and he left no forwarding address. I think he might have been. And if that's true, I'm not sure what to believe about anything. My grandfather was one of the pilots who flew the U-2 spy planes for the US in Taiwan. If you don't know the story, basically, the US needed to spy on China but couldn't spy on them themselves. As a result, they hired a few elite Taiwanese pilots to fly the US U-2 spy plane over China and take pictures. It was extremely top secret, and my who was about 4 or 5, was kept largely in the dark. My grandfather would be out for weeks at a time. One day, my grandmother took my mother to one of the local shrines in Taiwan. Upon arriving, a random priest approached them, said, "Your husband died in the ocean," and walked away. A few days later, Taiwanese officials informed my grandmother that her husband's plane had been shot down by Chinese anti-aircraft weapons and that his parachute had failed to deploy. He plummeted into the ocean and died on impact. There was no way for that random priest in that random city in Taiwan to have any knowledge of the top secret mission or even know that my grandfather was even involved. It was top secret to the point that my mother only learned more details about the entire event a few years ago, when much of it became declassified. Weird. Some things just can't be explained in this world. Pure coincidence just doesn't cut it. My father is a pretty logical engineer. I was never into supernatural stuff or going to church. He has always been an engineer-minded guy. Show me how it works, and I will believe it. When I was very young in Chicago, I slept in my own room in a crib. Every few nights, my father would be woken up by the sound of crashing and banging, as if the house was falling apart. It always originated in my crib room. He would race in there to see what it was and never see anything wrong. On multiple occasions, my folks would leave the house and come back to all the lights on and windows open. On another occasion, my father was woken up to the sounds of pots and pans being banged around downstairs. He went downstairs with a bat, yelling at whomever was doing it, only to find nothing. My mother awoke in the night to see someone standing over the bed. She hid under the sheets and woke up my father, but then the figure was gone. Now, I don't believe in anything I can't see, but my father is a very bright and logical guy, and he swears these things are not normal. It's the only reason I somewhat believe in ghosts today. It's the stories my parents tell of the first house we lived in. It happened to my mom, not me. She loved her aunt more than anything in the world, and one day before my brothers or I were born, her aunt passed away. My parents were living together, and that night mom couldn't sleep because she was convinced that her aunt wasn't going to get into heaven. She was either in tears or practically in tears and was really upset. All of a sudden, at midnight, she heard bells ringing above the bed. This only freaks her out more, but she thinks she's imaging it, so she lays there, not moving. The bells stop and start again in a couple minutes. She's close to waking up my dad but doesn't because she may have been upset and trying to cheer herself up. You know, a bell rings every time an angel gets its wings. After the second set of ringing, my dad asked her if she heard the bells. They took it as a sign that mom's aunt became an angel and got her wings. I live in a very close-knit mobile home community. Our neighbor and surrogate grandmother was an elderly woman who had abandoned her children after their father was killed in a traumatic accident. She suffered from a severe case of survivor's guilt, as she felt she should have been driving and killed instead of him. The incident and subsequent relationship with a mean-spirited man apparently caused a mental break that resulted in her walking away from her teenage children and the family farm. She spoke about her family as though they had existed in another lifetime and refused to give me their names or addresses. I got the sense that she believed they wanted nothing to do with her. Despite her checkered past, she was a loving and generous lady who could toss back a six-pack like no 88-year-old I have known. Her favorite toast was, "Here's to those who wish us well. Those who don't can go to hell." Her health and living conditions had declined to the point that she should have been in a home. She refused to go to a doctor and frequently stated, "I wish I would just hurry up and drop dead." This was always said in a good-natured, matter-of-fact way and often followed with a hearty cackle. Still, it was a surreal day when it was discovered that she had done just that. As the second person to see her body, I was quite certain that she had lost consciousness before hitting the ground and did not appear to suffer at all. Although I don't believe in the Christian versions of heaven and hell, I do believe that our life forces continue to exist beyond the confines of our physical forms. I was concerned that her spirit might be reluctant to move on, in fear of facing the repercussions of her choices in this life. After the medical examiner took away her body, I was sitting at my computer, with the door and windows open. I was stressed out about how I was going to track down her family and worried that she would end up in a pauper's grave if I didn't. Having helped her get on food stamps and Medicare, I had a file with scans of her ID card and SS card on my computer. The moment I clicked to open the folder, I heard what sounded like hundreds of bells ringing just outside. I jumped up and ran to the door to locate the source of the sound. As soon as I stuck my head outside, it stopped. I shrugged it off and sat back down. When I opened my browser to start researching her history, the loud bells started up again. Once more, I ran to the door, and once more, they stopped when I got there. Our wind chimes had been broken for weeks, and this was a sound that would have taken dozens of sets of chimes and strong wind to make. It was a frantic, high-pitched jangling sound, nothing that I've heard around here before or since. Over the next few days, I interviewed the neighbors and searched for a possible source of the ringing, to no avail. The words she always said whenever I did something for her came to mind: "I won't forget you." I like to believe that the bells were her way of letting me know that she appreciated what I was doing for her. With the help of a friend, I was able to find her family. They had such a tragic tale to tell of being abandoned for no good reason, combined with the sadness of never having a real mother. Still, her son and grandson made the long trip to come retrieve her belongings and family photos. They found a will describing her burial wishes and were able to get her body transported to the family plot. I was in the 7th grade when this happened. Also not on drugs. My grandfather on my father's side began his struggle with heart and lung failure in the summer of 2002. He was a long-time smoker, since 11, I think. Anyway, his health was rapidly deteriorating, and our family supported him while preparing for the inevitable. Fast forward to that winter, and one night while we're at home, the phone rings. My dad picks up, then lets us know that his father has passed. My mother took it pretty hard, almost worse than my dad, and went outside to get some air and cry in private. Not 2 minutes after she left, she started yelling for everyone to come outside and look up. My younger brother, father, mother, and I all stared upward, dumbfounded. Above our house, about 20 feet, give or take, was a massive, glowing halo. The night sky, aside from the halo, was entirely clear. No fog. No city lights, nothing could have created what we all saw late that night. The call from the hospital and the halo happened about 2 to 5 minutes apart from each other, so I always assumed they were related. It's the most surreal thing I've ever witnessed, and it's proof enough to me that there is something beyond at least this dimension of existence. To this day, I've experienced nothing like it. No, I don't have pictures. There was no camera at home while this happened, and my father just lost his dad, and he was, for all intents and purposes, the glue that held my insane family together, so we were all in a state of mourning and wide-eyed awe. I swear on everyone I love. Back in college, I met a new friend who claimed she could talk to spirits. I asked her to show me since I've been interested in hearing or experiencing supernatural stories for the longest time. She'd show me how to create an Ouija-like game. But instead of using the board that you buy from a Halloween store, she uses a blank sheet of paper and a pen. Homemade style, I suppose. With this blank sheet of paper, she had me write home in the center, yes on the top right corner, no on the top left corner, and goodbye at the bottom of the paper. In the center of the paper, which says home, we'd hold a pen with the ballpoint facing down. Carefully and patiently, we'd ask the spirit to come through. I won't get into all the successful stories, but I have to say it worked. I would ask if it knew my social security number, and it would answer back in cursive writing, on the paper. One of the freakiest moments was when my then boyfriend, our friends, and I were about to leave this house we rented, another long story, but it's not relevant. I convinced one of my girlfriends to play the paper pen's Ouija game with me. It was not a surprise, it answered a lot of our questions that we already knew the answers to. While we were still playing, my boyfriend and his friend were looking for Chris's, his friend's, car keys for about 15 minutes. I thought we could use the spirit's help and asked it if it knew where the car keys were. A few seconds later, it would write on the paper, Sam. 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 We were a little confused by that reply, since it had nothing to do with finding the keys. We asked it, "Are you trying to tell us your name is Sam?" The pen goes to no. Okay, let's try again, we thought. Then the pen wrote repeatedly, 11, 11, 11, 11. We looked at each other again. "Are you telling us you're 11 years old?" The pen goes to no. We both got frustrated, trying to decipher what it meant. About 10 minutes had passed. My boyfriend and Chris came rushing into our room, asking, "What did that pen just tell you guys? Something about Sam? And 11? We nodded, "Yeah, why?" They had this huge, surprising look on their faces and demanded that we walk with them to the parking lot. You guys won't believe this. I'm a skeptic, but that shit is crazy, he continued. We found Chris's car keys. That spirit thing you guys were talking about was right. He left his keys inside his own car. But, check this out. Look at the license plate number of the car behind Chris's car. So, as we slowly approached Chris's car, we scanned our eyes towards the license plate number of the car behind him. And read Sam 11. I loved the hell out of that. Gave all of us goosebumps. But I've stopped playing that game ever since. Several years ago, my mom began not feeling well. She finally called my dad, and they both left to go to the hospital. About halfway there, my mom said they had to stop to use the bathroom. My dad pulled over to a rest stop, but by the time my mom came back out, she was literally bleeding out, and my dad couldn't get her back in the car. At that point, a man came up to them and helped my dad get my mom into the car. He then told my dad that an ambulance was parked at the bottom of the ramp getting back on the highway and to take my mom there. My dad turned back around to say thank you, and the man had disappeared. Sure enough, there was an ambulance sitting where he had stated it would be, and they were able to get her to the hospital in time to save her life. So yes, I do believe in angels. This is more along the lines of aliens. When I was about 16, I went outside for a cigarette on a starry night. As I stood smoking, I looked up to watch the stars when I noticed something strange. I'm going to use the constellation of Orion for reference. There was a triangle of 3 red lights, each of which appeared to be similar in size to a star and each of which was spaced out from the other 2 lights by about the same distance that you can see between the stars of Orion's belt. This triangle was repeatedly circling around in a loop that would go around Orion's belt at the speed of about 1 loop every 6 seconds. The triangle itself was circling while the points of light didn't spin, i.e., the north point always pointed north. I watched it for about 5 minutes, thinking that if I went to get somebody, it would be gone. After a while, it made bigger loops, smaller loops, reverse loops, and infinity symbol loops. Deciding that it might hang around, I opened the front door of the house, saw my older sister, and told her to come out. Luckily, it was still there, and she was as baffled as I was. We watched it for a further 2 minutes or so when a second one, with green lights instead of red, appeared and mirrored the first one's movements in a reverse direction, side by side. They continued to do this in circular loops that got very wide and unbelievably fast. Let's say a loop with a diameter of 2 lengths of Orion at 2 revolutions per second. Then they stopped, dead still, right next to each other for about 3 seconds before zipping off over the horizon like the goddamned Enterprise in the opening of Star Trek: The Next Generation. I'm 29 now, and my sister and I still bring it up every now and then. Sure, I've always leaned more towards military testing, but even so, how the fuck? A few years ago, I went out of town for some important work, and my grandmother was admitted to the hospital. Just before leaving, I met her, as she got admitted and the doctors said she'd be okay. As I slept after a full day of work, I had a strange dream where both my grandma and grandpa visited me, saying that I shouldn't be sad that she is no longer here physically since they always watch over me. I woke up, called my parents to check how she was doing, and she had just passed away. It could have just been my worry for her that caused it, but the odd timing of it always makes me wonder since I never had any such dreams before or after. Moreover, my grandpa appeared first, and I instantly recognized him, which is odd because I hardly recognize his face since he passed away many years ago while I was still in preschool. Surely not the best one out there, but it makes me wonder at times since I hardly experience this. I don't know if it constitutes the supernatural, but it happened to my dad when he was a kid. My dad was a kid in the 70s, and one evening before dinner, he had a feeling that his father would not be home in time for supper. So he went into the kitchen and told my grandmother, "Dad won't be home for dinner, the car broke down." My grandmother asked, "How did he know? Did his father call?" She didn't hear the phone from the kitchen. My dad just shrugged and said, "I just have a feeling." Sure enough, my grandfather called the house soon after and said that he wouldn't be home for dinner, that the car broke down on the highway, and that he was at the repair shop until it could get fixed. My dad is a very rational man, and when he told us this, he was dead serious, and his brothers and sisters backed him up on the story. It's weird to think about how one gets, like, a gut feeling and can't explain it. You just know. My dad. When he was younger, my dad was in a pretty serious car accident. His arm was nearly torn right off, and he was beat up all to hell. He got to the hospital, and they put him under. He says that he remembers floating above his body and watching the doctors and surgeons work on him. After a while of that, he saw a bright white light and started moving towards it. As his eyes adjusted, he saw a bunch of our dead relatives who stopped him and told him that they couldn't stop him if he wanted to go, but that it wasn't his time, he still had work to do, and he needed to go back. He came back, woke up, and immediately started talking to his mother or my grandma. She confirms that he knew things he probably couldn't have known about the surgery, what the doctors and nurses looked like while he was under, what they were doing to him, and upon describing some of the dead relatives, they were people that he had never seen or met, dead before his birth, but that he could accurately describe the look of. Me. Not as fantastical, but a lot more significant as it happened to me. Was dating and had been dating this girl for about a year and a half at this point. We had always joked around about being specially connected or something because we could often tell if the other person was experiencing any really strong emotions, even when we were miles apart. I'd get worked up about something and suddenly receive a text saying, "It's okay, hon. Calm down. I love you." Out of the blue. The one incident that really sticks out is one Saturday when I was at work. Suddenly, in the middle of the day, I start feeling incredibly and uncontrollably nervous and fearful. It was so bad that I had to take a break for a while until I got it under control a bit. I thought it was weird but kind of forgot about it. Talking to the girlfriend the next day, I explained what happened to her. She looks a little startled and says, "What time?" "Right around 2 o'clock, I guess." That's right when my piano recital started. I was terrified. But I didn't tell you about that. Unlike the things happening to other people, I know I had no knowledge of that piano recital. I have no idea how or why, but it does leave me with a lot of questions. Okay, so a few years ago, a few friends of mine and I decided to take a road trip to Colorado to snowboard. Due to work, I could not leave at the same time and told them that I would come once I finished work. I worked 12-hour shifts 4 days a week. My friend was also unable to go with the rest of the group and came with me. I drove for a few hours but was tired miserably from working and lack of sleep. I asked her to drive, so we switched out, and I fell asleep. I would like to note that I am a heavy sleeper. This is especially true when I am asleep in automobiles. I feel a nudge like a push on my shoulder, which I would normally ignore, but for some reason I slowly open my eyes, thinking it was my friend nudging me. I look over and see that she fell asleep behind the wheel. I quickly grab the steering wheel and wake her up. We proceed to rest at an exit. Later, I tell her she was lucky to wake me up when she did, otherwise, we could have possibly died. She gave me a blank look and said she didn't know what I was talking about. When I was in 7th grade, I was having a bad day at school. I was about to walk through an open door when the wind suddenly made it start to slam on me. I winced and thought, no. And the door stopped and slammed open. Other kids saw it and could not explain it. Another time, when I was in 3rd grade, I once walked up to a bird, picked it up and petted it, then told it to fly away, and it did. A friend of mine saw the whole thing and freaked out. Another time, I was about 30 years old, and I was at a Christian death concert. A drunk guy kept hassling a friend of mine who has violent leanings. At one point, my friend turned to me so the guy couldn't see him and showed me he had a knife and was about to start carving on the guy. The next time the drunk guy started to hassle my friend, I stepped up to him and said peace in his ear. He looked at me for a moment, then broke down crying and left. I frequently hear what song is playing on the radio, in my head, right before I turn it on. I dream about events that go on to happen a year or so later. I frequently dream of solutions to problems I'm having. I have specific dreams about houses. When something very significant happens in my life, a new job or opportunity, a new friend, or I go to a place I've never been before. I haven't for a long time, but I used to have very real dreams about these people that were made of electricity that would come into my house while I was sleeping and tinker about. I would get out of bed and look at them, and then get into bed and try to figure out if I was dreaming or not. I'm pretty sure I was dreaming, but while lying awake, I could not figure it out. One time, at a summer camp in New Mexico, I woke up and it was daytime outside. A few of the other kids woke up too. We looked outside, and the sun wasn't up, but it was bright like daylight. It was about 2 a.m. A counselor came and made us go back to sleep. It was never explained. For me, it had to be talking to my grandpa after he died. In the summer of 2003, my grandpa had been suffering from bad headaches. He had a history of sinus infections, so he didn't think much of it. We noticed he was starting to get confused about small things, and so my half-sister and my dad took him to the emergency room. It turned out he had a brain tumor the size of a ping pong ball. The cancer had metastasized from his lungs, which he had been diagnosed with about 10 years prior. The tumor quickly ravaged his mind with fits of anger, senility, etc. There was only one day when he was in the hospital that he was pretty much his old self. A week after being admitted, he passed away from pneumonia. He was sedated for the last 2 days of his life, so we never got to say goodbye or anything along those lines. He left us so quickly after his diagnosis that it left us flabbergasted. About 3 days after he died, I was having a bad day grieving over his death. When I went to bed that night, I had the strangest dream. I was on this staircase, sweeping these stone steps, so high up that the clouds were below me. All of a sudden, this woman comes down and hands me a telephone. I grab it and say hello. The voice is my grandpa saying hello. I ask him how he's feeling, and he says he feels pretty good. He asks me how my guitar playing is coming along. I had recently taken it up, and I tell him it is going pretty well and I am learning some new chords. He said that was great. I told him I loved him, and he said he loved me too, and I hung up the phone. And then I woke up. Now flash forward about 6 months, and I'm talking to my half-sister while we're out having a cigarette. I had never mentioned my dream to anyone before because I figured it wasn't significant. I told her about the conversation my grandpa and I had in my dream, and she turned pale and dropped her cigarette. I asked her what was wrong. She said that a couple of days before he died, he woke up when the sedatives wore off. As my sister was waiting for a nurse to come administer more, he asked her how my guitar playing was coming along. When she told me that, I started shaking. I had never believed in ghosts or the possibility that someone could communicate with me in a dream like that. It was probably the one thing that helped me gain more closure over my grandpa's death, especially now that I got to say my goodbyes to him in a dream. When I was younger, my mother never kept pictures of her mother, my grandmother, in the house and told me very little about her. I used to have dreams about her telling me stories, and I would be able to describe her exact outfit, jewelry, hairstyle, and the stories she would tell me, stuff that I had never heard before. She would tell me Aesop's fables in my sleep. Apparently, many of the things I described were her favorite outfits from when my mother was a child, mid-late 950s, and many rings, bracelets, and necklaces that were stolen sometime in the mid-70s, 15 years before I was born. That always kind of spooked me. Also, when my uncle died of brain cancer, I knew it without having to be told. I was on a bus from Calgary to Vancouver at the time, and I woke up from a half sleep, and somehow I just knew he was gone. My whole body ached, like the kind of soreness you get when you have exhausted yourself from crying. I found out later that this happened right at his approximate time of death. A few experiences. Story 1. As a teenager, I visited my best friend for a few days when she had to move away for a while. Having not seen each other for a while, we were staying up super late. I had my Ouija board with me, and rumor had it that the former tenant had been murdered. So it's like 3 a.m. or later, and we're getting tired and bored, not really asking the board serious questions anymore. Getting answers like yes, California, does CA stand for California? Yes. Nah. Does NA stand for Nebraska? When suddenly, yes. Tarnish a memory, tear my bones, carry my body. Me, did you spell that out, Han? Friend, no, did you? Me, no. So, bored, is the reason I'm not freaked out because of my guardian angel that I supposedly have? Bored, yes. Friend, then what is it that I'm sensing? Bored, Dea. And at that point, she threw the piece away violently, which made me scream, which made her scream. Story 2. I turned on my radio one night to make some noise while I got ready for bed since I was on edge. I went to brush my teeth, and when I came back in the room, the radio wasn't playing. It was on, but there was no sound. I finally started hitting the volume button and eventually began hearing noises that I had never heard before or since come from a radio. I slammed the off button and jumped into bed. Story 3. My cousin-in-law calls my female family members the coven. High levels of intuition run in our family, often giving the impression we are psychic. One of my cousin's kids has had tea with my dead grandfather, whom she has never met, and apparently pointed out details about him that no one ever told her. The same child started sobbing uncontrollably one night before bed, insisting, "Jeannie's crying, my aunt." After unsuccessfully trying to calm her down, her mother calls my aunt to show the kid everything was fine, only to find out that my aunt had shut her hand in the oven and was, indeed, crying. The same aunt had the dogs go wild at her house in the country one night, and as she stood out on the deck, she started hearing drum beats, calls like from Native Americans, and galloping horses. The sound came up from the valley and passed over the house. I myself have experienced various premonitions, mostly minor in nature, like things that I saw that actually happened a few seconds later. Even with the frequency of weird situations in the family, I'm not necessarily a believer. I just grant the possibility that there's something out there we can't recreate or measure with instruments. I've been surrounded by supernatural phenomena my whole life. It's happened when I was alone or with other people. I've been through therapy and have never been diagnosed with a mental illness. At some point, when you see things enough, especially with witnesses who see them too, you have to decide if you're all crazy or if it's actually happening. Considering how many times this stuff happens, I have to say it's real rather than that I'm crazy, especially since I've been diagnosed as perfectly sane many times. One incident happened when I was about 7 years old. My older sister was picking on me, as usual. We never got along. She was being such a mean bitch and had said something nasty to me. I remember feeling really angry at her, and all of a sudden, one of my mom's bowling trophies flew off a shelf and smacked my sister in the head. It freaked both of us out. The shelf was about 6 feet behind me, there's no way I could have done it, and my sister was across the room, so she didn't do it. No one else was home. The trophy cut her scalp when it hit her. That incident didn't stop her from being a royal bitch to me throughout our childhood together, though. There is one thing that makes me think that there is a chance that supernatural things do happen. It was back in 1992, and I was a senior in high school. A friend of mine lived next to a cemetery with his grandparents, and we were going back to his house to hang out for a bit. The road itself is small, and there are only 3 houses on it. There is never any traffic, and it is very easy to see any cars on it from a distance. The cemetery is about a foot from the road and has high bushes around it, with 2 fence entrances facing the road. Well, it was around 8 p.m., and I had my headlights on. As I turned up his street, there was this weird green form, like a cloud or smoke, hovering about a foot off the ground. It was about 3 feet wide and just hovered in the middle of the road. I was sort of startled and then just drove through it. In my mind, I was trying to think if I had seen a car or something pull out from his road, and I knew I hadn't. To even get on his road, you have to go on a side street, and there have been no cars there. We go inside, and I am not saying anything, and after a minute, my friend says to me, "You can't tell me you did not see that thing in the road." I told him that I did not know what it was. His grandfather was there and told me that he used to be a groundskeeper for the cemetery and that he quit doing it because he saw things like it. To this day, we joke about it, and I think there has to be a simple explanation for it, but what I don't know. Nobody will fucking believe me, but fuck you guys, I'm saying it anyway. I was laying in bed next to my boyfriend one morning, and everything was peaceful and bright as the sun had risen and was shining through the window. I was wide awake, and I began thinking about what it would be like to be possessed. Boredom is funny like that. I closed my eyes and envisioned swiftly pushing all thoughts out of my mind, and I said to myself in my head, I give permission to have my body and mind possessed by a spirit. I was laying on my back at the time, slightly elevated by my elbows, and something pushed me flat on my back hard. My elbow was then touching my sleeping boyfriend's ribcage. All I could hear was a rushing sound in my ears. I started feeling like I was going to fall through the bed because I was being pushed into it so hard. I realized that I would fall through the bed, the floor, the 3rd floor, the 2nd floor, and the 1st floor, but then what? I started to freak out. I couldn't move any part of my body, but I was struggling with everything I had in me. Remember that my elbow was against a sleeping person? I realized that if I woke him up, maybe he could see what was going on, help me, or something. I put all my strength and energy into jabbing him in the ribcage. I couldn't move my arm at all. I tested my fingers, and I could slightly move them, but not enough to help anything. I was still struggling to not fall through the bed, but I felt like I was losing that fight. I could kind of see my bedroom still, though mostly through a thick lens of gray static. Still, a rushing, roaring sound filled my head. Inside, I was struggling, screaming, and fighting. And then it was done. All that fighting and yelling came through, and I lurched forward in bed onto my knees, screaming. The boyfriend woke up and held me and asked what the fuck was wrong and why I was shaking so much. I didn't know what to tell him. I still don't. Since then, I've not been able to clear my mind or meditate at all because the panic of losing control of my body rushes in and floods my head. Broad daylight. Wide awake. I try not to think about it anymore. Oh God, where should I start? Growing up in my parents' home, every so often I would see this tall shadow walk by from the corner of my eye. Yeah, big deal. I could be imagining things. But what made it more eerie is that I have an older sister who noticed it too, and way too many times we both noticed it at the same time. Fast forward a bit, this happened in 7th grade. I just got home from school, with my mom being the only one home. She decides to go to the store and asks me if I want to come along. Up to this point, I have never been home alone, but the neighbors were home and stayed with the in-laws next door. So I'm there alone in the kitchen, playing with my Lego at the kitchen table while watching Robotech, which I didn't want to miss. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the shadow pass by through the connecting hallway. I try to ignore it and continue what I was doing, but I fumble with a piece of Lego, and it falls to the floor, ending up in the hallway. I have more of that same piece and leave it there, and I continue building what I was working on. Moments later, I felt something hit the side of my head, and I heard the sound of Lego landing in the pile of Lego in front of me. Slowly, I looked towards the hallway. That piece of Lego on the floor wasn't there anymore. I went to the neighbors and ate chocolate cake till my mom came back home. When I was a kid, I didn't know how to swim. One day I went with my family to a relative's party whose home featured a swimming pool. I got bored, went out back alone, and walked around the pool when I noticed a leaf floating near the edge. I kneel down on both knees and try to grab it, but I lose my balance. I grab the edge of the pool with both hands to try to steady myself, but to no avail. I'm completely falling forward, and my feet are not touching the ground anymore either. I remember my face getting mere inches from the water, but suddenly I was somehow forced back up. I decided to go back inside and join the party. This one happened to my sister. Note, a week before this incident, our grandmother died from a sudden stroke at our home. My sister actually found the body. My sister was walking home from school and climbing the wide or long front staircase to our home, a Victorian. There were no railings either. Near the top, she loses her balance and starts falling backward. She remembers seeing an open blue sky when, all of a sudden, some unknown force pushes her back up. She says she thinks it was Grandma. When I was about 18, my sister moved out, so I moved into her room since it was larger and had its own restroom. Her room always felt a bit creepy, and I had a hard time sleeping at night. One night while sleeping, I was awoken by this great pressure on my chest. I opened my eyes, and in the twilight, I can see this tall, human-like shadow standing on my chest. I freaked out, shook my head a few times, and it was gone. Months later, the in-law next door becomes free, and I decide to move there. About 4 years ago, I'm 38 now, BTW, I vacationed in the Philippines for about a month. I also had a cousin who was getting married there. Anywho, one night I'm hanging out with another cousin who's from there when we get this wild idea to visit one of the old cemeteries where we have a number of relatives buried. He wanted to point out where one of our aunts was buried since I had already visited the graves of every other relative earlier in the week. This was probably around 10 p.m. at night. It was kind of a dare too, just for fun. So we take his mope there, with me riding on the back. There's this gravel road that cuts through the center of the graveyard, so we start to travel on that with the only illumination coming from the twilight and his moped's headlight. My cousin drives slowly, just barely fast enough to go forward and keep the mope righted, but about 75 feet in, he suddenly stops, and we both need to put our feet down. Maybe we were going too slow? Paying it no heed, we decide to continue. After about another 20 feet, he suddenly stops again. My cousin turns his head to look at me with a big WTF expression on his face, and he tells me that this time he felt something force him to turn his wheel all the way to the side. I respond that maybe we should GTFO, he nods and turns his mope around. As we start to head back out, I tell him I can hear the sound of feet walking on gravel behind me. He says he can hear it too, so he kicks it into high gear, and we get the hell out of there. No, we did not drink or imbibe anything that night. So during my stay in the Philippines, I'm staying at different relatives' homes. Many of them are pretty old. A couple days after the above incident, it's morning, and I'm starting to wake up but decide to chill in bed for a bit longer. Suddenly I feel one of the corners of the bed sink like someone is getting on it, and I can hear or feel the bed spring squeak too. I shot up immediately, as there should be no one else in the room, and there isn't. At that moment, I decided to go stay at another relative's home, who was inviting me to stay over. Later that evening, I'm back with another cousin who's there with me to help me bring my belongings to that other relative's place. I'm not freaked out or anything from earlier anymore at this point, but I did describe to her what happened to me in the morning, and she just laughed it off. Anyway, I toss my suitcase on the bed and start packing my gear while we chat. As I was placing stuff in the suitcase, suddenly what I can best describe as a 45-inch wide ball of light, will-o-wisp, danced from left to right across the bed, and my suitcase then disappeared. Immediately I jumped the fence and said, WTF. I turned to face my cousin to ask if she saw what I just did. Her mouth was agape. She did. The weirdest thing I remember about that ball of light is that it did not give off light, it did not illuminate, and it did not cause any shadows. And I had another one while I was in the Philippines. I wanted to visit Baguio, and the same cousin who I was with during the cemetery incident offered to come with me. One of the stories I've heard about Baguio is that in what I think was the mid-80s, there was a massive earthquake in the region that caused a Hyatt hotel to collapse, killing hundreds of people. So my cousin and I are checking out the sights, just wandering around. He doesn't really know the city either, but it's not that large. At one point, we were walking on the side of a fairly busy road behind this old military college, teachers' camp, making our way towards downtown. It starts to rain, so we decide to take refuge at a covered bus stop or shelter until it passes. While waiting, we both lit up a cigarette. Cars, taxis, and buses pass by. We can hear the buzz of a distant radio in the direction of the college. Off to the side and across the road, we see this old man pulling a horse, not unusual. He heads towards this unremarkable gated chain-link fence, which happens to be directly across from us. He enters, taking the horse with him, closes the gate, and disappears off into the distance. Moments later, things started to seem odd. There were no vehicles passing by, the ambient sound seemed muffled, I couldn't hear that radio, the cigarette smoke we blew out hung in the air, and it started to get cold, very cold. I got goosebumps, and I could see my breath. Hello, tropical weather? It was like time had stopped or slowed down to a crawl. At the exact same moment, my cousin and I both turned our heads to face each other. I said something weird is going on and he said yeah, then I said let's go. He got up without a word and started walking. I followed. Maybe just 10 feet away from the bus stop, I could hear that distant radio again, and vehicles started to whiz by. It was still raining, just not as hard. We didn't talk about what happened and eventually made our way downtown. Later that day, after we did some shopping, we decided to take a cab to go check out the summer palace or cottage of the President of the Philippines. On the way there, I asked my cousin to ask the taxi driver to point out anything noteworthy on our way. We happened to be on the same road we walked on earlier. As we drove past the gated and fenced area across the bus stop, the taxi driver pointed out that was where the Hyatt Hotel collapsed. My cousin and I faced each other, did the WTF stare, then shook our heads. Now that was effing eerie. It bothers me that I have a hard time scientifically or logically explaining to myself what happened each of those times. But hell, even more so since I was a full-grown adult when I was in the Philippines. To top it off, I wasn't alone a few of those times. Not cool. I grew up in a 125-year-old Victorian house. The stairs to the basement would occasionally make noises as if someone were walking upstairs. Things sometimes fell off counters randomly when no one was near them. I once saw a figure leaning in the doorway of my room, too. All that was weird but not creepy enough to make me think, oh, ghosts. Of course. It's an old house, it makes noise, I was a kid and probably saw my mom checking in on us, etc. The one thing that did creep me out happened when I was in 8th grade and had a friend over for a sleepover. We were sleeping in cots set up in the basement, about 5 feet away from each other. The bedrooms were on the main floor, and my parents and brother were upstairs. I woke up in the middle of the night to see a man standing over my friend, just looking at her. After about 30 seconds, he turned and, without a glance at me, opened the door to the bathroom. I saw then that the bathroom light was on and very bright, walked in, then closed the door behind him. Thinking it was my brother, I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. When I asked him the next day why he had come downstairs when we had a closer bathroom on the main floor, he told me he hadn't even woken up during the night. Creepy. Super random story. I was an LDS missionary in Baltimore, and we were all hanging out one day when another pair of Spanish missionaries came in. They were usually loud and joyful guys, but today they were really quiet and acting weird. I asked them about it, and they told me how their day went. They had spent the previous night sharing friend of a friend crazy stories and random creepy things. The next day they went tracting door to door. For the record, missionaries hate doing that more than you hate seeing them there, but they came across one peculiar fellow. The house was normal, but he opened the door, and the walls were odd colors with writing all over him. The man came out in a tuxedo and a limo driver's hat, except it looked like it was from the 1950s and was faded, dusty, and torn in places. They went into their usual spiel. As a missionary, odd things or people playing pranks become common day to day, but the man cut them off, garbling some weird gibberish. They stood and stared for a while as he transitioned into English and told them the TV was showing him videos of the world to come. The missionaries decided it was probably time to cut this one loose and said they would be on their way. He said to wait. Then he ran his finger down one of their cheeks and said, "Rosy cheeks." Then started laughing. They decided to briskly walk away and quit knocking for a day, but back in the car, the line the man touched had broken out into a line of acne down the guy's face. The moral is that, I don't know, maybe the guy was crazy and had something weird on his finger, or missionaries should never knock on doors again. Once I went on vacation with my friend and her family. She has a large family, so we had to share a pull-out bed in the living room. We were up at night chatting, laughing, and doing girly things you do at a sleepover when we decided to settle down and go to sleep. So we are laying there looking around, getting comfortable, when I happen to look at the dark hallway and see a silhouette of a man, but he was partially glowing around the edges of the silhouette. He was there for probably 30 seconds just standing there, then just like that, it's gone. I didn't react, but I was terrified. I didn't say anything because maybe I was being dumb and making things up when I hear my friend whisper, "Did you see that man?" She called out for her uncle. He was upstairs in his room, and he was the only man in the house at that time, but he was sleeping. You can't see any car lights going by the house because we were in the middle of the woods, so there was no chance of weird lighting. I was freaked out for the rest of the vacation. There were a couple things on vacation that were really strange, but that sticks out as the strangest. My mother has a really strong memory of her dad coming over to her in their backyard and offering to play with her for the first time ever when she was 9 years old. He was generally a very serious, stern, and emotionally distant man. He pushed her around on her bike, played ball with her, played hide and seek, and spent the whole morning with her just having a laugh. When she went into the house for lunch, she learned that there was no way her father had done that because he had died of stomach cancer the night before. My mom had been locked out of the house that morning because her mother wanted to make arrangements without kids underfoot. To this day, my mother is convinced that it was her father's spirit stopping by to give her one good memory of him before passing on to wherever. I always thought it must be a manufactured memory to give her comfort over losing her dad at such a young age, but who really knows? For her, it's the only proof she has that he loved her. Our entire family treats the event as a fact. A woman who was a close family friend was diagnosed with stomach cancer while pregnant with her son. This was almost 30 years ago, so the only option was pretty much to terminate the pregnancy to allow treatment. She was a very devout Catholic. She chose to forego treatment until her child was born. After her child was born, she underwent surgery to try and remove some of the cancerous tissue. Upon opening her, doctors found so much cancerous tissue that they decided that she was terminal and closed her back up. She began praying, asking God to at least allow her to raise her son and see him grow up safely. A later CT scan showed her completely free of cancer. About 20 years later, her son went into the police academy and got married. Less than a year later, she was diagnosed with cancer again, and it spread at a ravaging pace until she died. On her deathbed, she recalled her prayer and said she was not sad to die and that God had given her exactly what she asked for. Even thinking about this story still messes with me to this day. I've had 2 experiences. The first can be corroborated by 4 other people. The second, well, I could have just been hallucinating. First story, it was my freshman year in college. I get in bed when I hear my roommate say, Smalls, look at the ceiling. 6 green, glowing handprints are staggered across the ceiling like someone crawled over it. They had huge handprints too. We run out of the room and get our neighbors. We tell them we think we're being haunted. We're immediately called out as trying to trick them. We hit the lights and showed them the handprints. I go to turn the light back on once we're done observing, and 3 more handprints are now on the wall. They're continuing the crawl towards the light switch. We're freaked out at this point. We get wet cloths to remove the handprints. And the washing seems to work. They're gone once we're done wiping down the ceiling and walls. We discuss how weird it was, then decide to see if the handprints are still there. Hit the lights again, and now all 9 handprints are back, plus 6 more that now appear on the ceiling above the bunk bed 2 of my friends were sitting on. We couldn't get the handprints to go away that night. We fell asleep in the room with the handprints. I slept soundly through the night, which I also consider pretty odd considering the circumstances. Second story, I'm 22 years old and home on winter break from college. I wake up in the middle of the night and see that someone is in my room. My eyes are adjusting to the darkness, so I could make out that it was a woman. I assume it's my mom, and I ask her what she's doing. I get no response. Now I'm getting very worried. I ask again, no response. My eyes keep adjusting to the darkness. It's a woman in a white nightgown standing 3 to 4 feet from my bed. I keep looking at the figure. Now I notice that it's a girl, maybe 14 years old, just standing there. I notice her eyes are fixed on me as she's slowly rotating to her left and her head is cocked on her shoulder. Then I realize it's as if she's hanging from the ceiling and staring at me as she's slowly rotating. Yes, I know this sounds crazy, and I was well aware of it at the time. I told myself this is a waking dream, and it's not happening at all. I made myself stay there and stare back at her, knowing it would go away. I could do this for only about 5 more seconds, probably a lot less in reality, but it seemed like more, before I busted into my parents' room in my boxers at 3 in the morning, screaming about ghosts. That's right, A 22-year-old wearing nothing but his boxers is screaming to his parents that there are ghosts in his room. Of course, nothing was there once we went back to the room. This was most likely a waking dream. But man, I was staring at the figure for a long time, telling myself it was all in my head. That figure still stayed there until I couldn't take it anymore. When I was younger, we would go ghost hunting. We never really expected to see anything, but Ohio is known to have a plethora of supposedly haunted venues. One night we went out to a dilapidated old house that was supposedly haunted. We poked around a bit and filmed while we were doing it. Nothing really exciting happened until we went to check out the locked up machine building out back. This is where it got freaky. As we were walking out to it, we noticed at least 10 do not enter signs posted, as well as just how well sealed the shop was. The doors were barred, chained, nailed, and welded shut. Instantly, the temperature around us dropped, and we could see our breath. It was a 70-degree night in the height of summer. We all got this strange feeling of something dark pushing us away from the shop. We proceeded to get the hell out of there. Later, reviewing our footage, we confirmed you could see our breath. You could see it the instant it happened. All 3 people and the camera person stopped dead in their tracks at the exact same time. I've been to a lot of haunted places, and this is the only thing that's made me a believer with first-hand experience. There were 2 times when I saw a low-flying UFO, most likely a prototype B-3 bomber, when I lived near an Air Force base that was randomly shut down for a while. The other was this story a stripper told me. She came over to my apartment, which my grandfather owned, and said she was getting freaked out by the building. She had always claimed that she had psychic powers and could hear the dead, etc., and we laughed at her. Anyway, I'll try to speed this up. My current roommate at the time was there the night the stripper started rambling this crazy story about a newlywed wife being murdered and buried at the bottom of a well with this part of the house being built on top of it. The original building was an old school cafeteria, and she mentioned that as well. While hearing this story, my roommate freaked out because his uncle told him a story about how my roommate's great-grandfather killed his first wife and buried her in a well. Apparently he told this to his uncle as a child on his deathbed. I laughed and said, "This is all just silly," etc. About 2 months later, my grandfather showed up and wanted to meet my roommate. Turns out my grandfather purchased the property from his great-grandfather at a crazy low price and then turned the building into 3 separate apartments. I remembered what the stripper said and thought, wow, that's just a weird coincidence. Years later, my grandfather's health started failing, so I and some other family members started looking after his rental properties. I got a call from a tenant saying a pipe froze, etc. I got a propane torch and some solder and went to investigate. Traced the pipe to the start of the problem under the house through this crazy small crawl space. I set my torch down on the rim of some bricks and noticed they were in a circle. I used my flashlight to look down, and it was a stone well that someone had poorly sealed up. Then I remembered the stripper, freaked out, left, and called for a plumber to do the job.